You're listening to the 12th module in the Online International Security course. In this module, we have two topics that we are going to discuss. The first being the problem of health security in a globalized age. And in the second part of the module, we'll focus on cybersecurity. Hopefully you'll be able to see how we talk about human security, we're talking about a set of issues that overlap with each other. In order to secure civic rights, we need to also secure economic rights. In trying to secure economic rights in the forms of wealth generation and development, we also have to be concerned about protecting the environment and not depleting resources. And we see this another extension of this when we talk about health security. In order to create economic development, in order to secure political rights, people need to be healthy and not fear of coming down with some sort of sickness that is going to cause an outbreak within the population. That's going to prevent a state from developing properly because they have to constantly deal with these health threats. And so health security is very much tied into what we've already talked about here. When you have an outbreak of infectious disease, and that will be mostly what we focus on here, infectious diseases, it creates a large number of deaths and injuries, and oftentimes more deaths and injuries that you would see in an actual armed conflict. Disease outbreaks are very problematic in that not only can they cause greater casualties, but there's really no way to prevent them. We have not yet developed ways of dealing with viruses because nature is full of trillions and trillions and trillions of viruses of different sizes and shapes, and it's impossible to eliminate them all. So these outbreaks are going to take place. And as we've talked about before, development and the challenges of development include many global health issues. We talked about hunger and malnutrition in a previous module, and that is part of the global health focus. We're not going to talk about that here because we touched upon it sufficiently, I think, in previous units. Same with water and sanitation. We talked about it during the development module, so we're not going to spend too much time on it here. Our main focus, as I've already mentioned, is the problem of infectious disease and how that creates problems and threatens the ability of states to perform and function properly, and of course, the threat to human life that infectious diseases pose. While the focus on global health as a security concern may be relatively new, notice that the problem of infectious disease is certainly not new. We need only reread a text that we have looked at before, in this case Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, to see how he chronicles an outbreak of plague in ancient Athens that resulted in the deaths of thousands of individuals, and ultimately, according to Thucydides, contributed to the loss of Athens in that particular war, that if the plague had not broken out, then maybe Athens doesn't lose that conflict. In subsequent centuries, in the Middle Ages, we have the Black Death outbreak that is believed to have killed a third of the European population in the 1300s. And more recently, we have outbreaks of different strains of flu that result in large numbers of both death and incapacitation. During World War I, for example, the so-called Spanish flu wound up killing more Americans than the number of American soldiers who died in the trenches in World War I. So it gives you a sense of how dangerous these infectious diseases can be and why it's important for states to have an ability to deal with them. The diseases we're going to look at are the ones that are most recognizable and most important, in large part because they're the most deadly. Flu, which we all probably have some experience with, turns out to be a rather dangerous and deadly disease. in certain contexts. And so we'll see how various strains of the flu have been very challenging for states to confront and contain when you have outbreaks. HIV/AIDS was a huge problem a few decades ago. It's less of a problem now, although, as we'll see in certain parts of the world, especially sub-Saharan Africa, HIV/AIDS is a genuine epidemic with millions of people both infected and suffering from symptoms of the disease. Malaria is another disease that we see mostly in tropical zones around the world that continues to be a problem and a challenge for states to deal with. And of course, the disease that gets most of the attention these days when you have an outbreak of it, and we haven't had an outbreak in a few years, thank goodness, is Ebola. And we'll talk a little bit about Ebola here in a moment. Now, as I've already mentioned, diseases have always been a problem. But the perception is that in globalization, they are more of a problem now than they necessarily were in the past. A lot of this has to do with the nature of globalization and and the emergence of technologies that allow for human beings and organic products and other platforms for carrying the disease to move around the world much more quickly, much more rapidly, to more places around the world in a shorter period of time. Obviously, human beings are a primary carrier of viruses that cause infectious diseases, and when you have people who can get on jet aircraft and fly around the world in a matter of hours, it becomes very important for states to monitor and have a sense of the risks that come from people traveling around the world, especially if they're traveling from areas where we know outbreaks of certain diseases are taking place. Certain other sources of disease are things that have always existed that we can't really worry about. Things like migrating birds. You know, birds have always migrated, but they notice they can be a problem. They can be a source of spreading an infectious disease because obviously borders can't keep migrating birds out. This is important because the idea of a bird migrating also conjures up the image of various forms of biomass that are in transit. Food in large quantities can be a carrier of disease, and so if it's not refrigerated properly, it's not inspected properly, if it's tainted, that can be a carrier of disease around the world. Let's begin with flu, and I don't think we need to go into too much detail about what flu is because it's something we probably all have firsthand experience with. Flu is a respiratory infection, which means that when a person is infected, the virus reproduces itself and the excess virus is transmitted through respiration. In other words, the virus is exhaled by the infected patient, and those viruses travel through the air across a certain amount of distance where the virus is still able to be viable, is then breathed in by another organism, and then that virus then infects the new host and the process repeats itself. And not every virus can be transmitted via respiration, but those that do tend to be very infectious. They tend to be able to spread very rapidly because if a virus has the ability to survive outside of a warm human body, that allows it to be able to transmit itself much more readily and much more widely around the world. We have to remember that seasonal flu is one of the most deadly diseases that exists because year after year, repeatedly, we see thousands of people succumb to the flu around the world. Keep that in mind when we start talking about Ebola and the terrible consequences and symptoms of Ebola, which are truly horrific. But Ebola outbreaks are relatively rare. Every year we know there's going to be a flu outbreak. Every year we know that we may in fact experience firsthand one of these flu outbreaks. That's why when you go to the drugstore, they're always reminding you take your flu shot because this is something we know is going to happen. And the fear is, and recent history, as we'll see in a moment, has shown that sometimes these flu viruses can be quite potent and can cause outbreaks that pose a much greater challenge in terms of public health than a typical year where a typical virus is present. So, as already mentioned, there was one of the worst flu outbreaks that we saw, one of the worst pandemics that we saw was in 1918. But more recently, we've seen some pandemics that were of significant consequence, although not killing nearly as many people as the one in 1918 did. In the early 2000s, we saw the outbreak of SARS, which is sort of a variant of the flu virus. SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. It emerged out of East Asia, primarily China and Indochina, and spread to Canada in 2003. We believe on a couple of people who were infected with SARS got on a flight to Toronto, and there was a brief panic in Canada in the Toronto area because some people who had tested positive for SARS had arrived in Canada and were threatening to spread the disease throughout North America. Nothing really came of this. There was a few infections, but it was more or less contained. But for a while there was genuine fear about this disease, the virus spreading throughout the world. In China and Indochina, it killed about 800 people and it incapacitated about 8,000 for a significant period of time. And the fear was sufficient with regards to this potentially becoming a true pandemic worldwide that they canceled several international events in China that were scheduled for the year 2003, including the Women's World Cup. A few years after SARS, we get the bird flu. This is the H1N5 virus, and oftentimes these flu viruses are given these designated numbers, which refer to how the chromosomes are coded. The bird flu emerged out of Asia when it passed from the bird population there to humans. Although we found, as we looked at it more closely, that while the virus was very communicable within the bird population and did have the ability to leap into the human population, once it reached a human host, it lost some of its potency. That the virus worked better being transmitted from one bird, one chicken, one hen to another bird, to another chicken, than it did from a human to human contact. So if you were a human who worked in chicken farms, who worked, closely around, animals, around birds, you were more vulnerable to this virus than if you had a few degrees of separation. A few years later, however, we did see the emergence of a very powerful flu virus called the swine flu, or H1N1. The virus, it was believed to have come from a pig farm in Mexico, although it turns out that that wasn't true, that it was just a particularly powerful strain of a regular flu virus. This virus was very infectious. It was very easy to get this virus once it entered a fairly dense population. In 2009, it's believed to have killed about 10,000 people and several thousand more, tens of thousands of more, beyond the United States. I know that I was teaching at this time and at Colorado State, and I know the school basically had a policy where if you had any kind of flu-like symptoms, you were automatically excused from going to class. You were encouraged to stay home, to stay in bed, to stay in your dorm room or what have you, so that you didn't go to class and infect all your classmates. I was a little panicky at the time. It was very interesting. Another infectious disease that people are fairly familiar with is HIV/AIDS. This is a disease that is the result of a virus attacking the body's immune system. Now, the virus itself won't kill you, but what happens is that the virus destroys your immune system, and then when you contract a relatively minor type of infection or bacteria, something like a routine common cold, your body doesn't have the ability to fight that infection or that disease or that bacteria off, and you wind up dying as a result of something rather mundane. HIV/AIDS is transmitted through bodily fluids, primarily blood, although obviously it can be transmitted through sexual fluids as well. That's why health departments encourage people to use some kind of contraception to protect you from being exposed to potentially infected bodily fluids if you are engaging in sexual activity. Also, if you are a drug user and using needles that have been already consumed or used by an HIV positive person, you are essentially injecting that HIV positive blood into your own bloodstream and significantly increasing the possibility that you will contract the disease yourself. For a while, there's a great deal of uncertainty about HIV/AIDS. At one point, before we knew for sure how the virus was transmitted, there was a fear that it was in fact an airborne disease and that simply being around individuals who are HIV positive puts you at risk of contracting the disease. We know that's not true now, that you can live and work and generally exist around an HIV positive person, and there's no chance that you'll contract the disease so long as you aren't exposing yourself to blood or any other type of bodily fluid from an HIV positive person. Because AIDS is primarily spread through sexual activity, we see those parts of the world that struggle with trying to control things like sex tourism and sexual trafficking. We see these parts of the world trying to deal with and confront the problem HIV/AIDS infection. In places like South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, there are huge infection rates with regards to HIV/AIDS. One area in South Africa that's particularly notorious is the so-called Highway of Death, where truckers and other transport workers who will, at the end of the day, park at a hotel and hire some kind of sex worker will essentially have an encounter with an HIV positive person, and then they themselves will become HIV positive and then spread that disease to their life partners, to their intimate partners, to their children. If they're a woman who's HIV positive, the child runs a very high risk of also being HIV positive. So in this particular part of South Africa, where you have sex workers and service workers who have high HIV infection rates, spread these disease to those who work and operate along this thoroughfare. Areas around military bases and where military troops are deployed tend to see boosts in HIV positive infection rates. Again, when you have large numbers of men and soldiers deployed either at bases or in some kind of other deployment, when they go seek the comfort of a woman, they oftentimes will not know that the woman is HIV positive or not care, and as a result, you'll see a spread of the disease. Also, commercial and business travel, people traveling to parts of the world where there's a problem with HIV infection rates, they don't take proper precautions, and they themselves contract the disease, go back to their home countries, and spread it from there. This map gives you a good sense of where HIV infection rates are the biggest problem. And again, as I pointed out, Sub-Saharan Africa has a real problem here. In certain countries like Botswana and South Africa, you have infection rates of 1 in 3. Doesn't mean that they all have the actual disease, but that 1 in 3 test positive for the virus. And without proper medical care, without proper drug regimens, it's inevitable that when you are HIV positive, that if you will act, your body will not be able to fight off the virus, and you will get the fully developed AIDS disease, which again is almost always fatal. These tropical countries also struggle with malaria. Malaria is actually a bacteria that is insect-borne. When insects land on your skin and bite you, they essentially infect you with the bacteria. Malaria is treatable. If you contract malaria, there are drugs that can prevent you from succumbing to the worst effects of the disease. And like chickenpox, if you contract malaria, usually you are immune to it afterward. The problem is that if you contract malaria and you don't have access to the proper medications, and you have a weak immune system, and you have a weak body generally, chances are good that you will succumb to the disease. And in this case, children are particularly vulnerable. It's believed that 3,000 children die every day as a result of being exposed to malaria. And there's a genuine concern that with global warming, these mosquitoes that spread malaria can now live in places they couldn't live before because the climate is warmer in certain areas and can accommodate these mosquitoes, including parts of the United States where malaria has more or less been eradicated. There's a fear that it could come back and cause a problem again. It's not just malaria that's a threat here with regards to these insect-borne infections. West Nile is another insect-borne disease. This one is a virus that's carried by mosquitoes that, again, was not a threat outside of the tropical zones until we started noticing that the mosquitoes that carried West Nile were surviving and thriving and expanding into parts of the world that they hadn't been before. Fortunately, West Nile is not often lethal. In fact, it's actually rarely lethal. Very few people actually die as a result of being infected with West Nile. The worst that happens is some kind of skin discoloration, fever, nausea, vomiting, the usual flu symptom suspects. It's interesting to note that in Colorado, where you wouldn't think a tropical disease would thrive, Weld County, which is the county just to the east of Fort Collins, has one of the largest concentrations of West Nile patients in the United States. In other words, that the mosquitoes that carry West Nile have found a particularly comfortable home in Weld County, in the lands around Weld County. And as a result, we have a very large concentration of infected patients there. So this isn't something that's a problem for other parts of the world. This is something that strikes very close to home. And you might remember before the Olympics, there was the Zika outbreak, or at least the scare associated with Zika. Again, another insect-borne virus. Again, fairly large mosquitoes that are native to South America carry this particular virus, and again, when bit, don't necessarily cause death in fully grown adults, but have shown to be quite lethal to children and to the fetuses of mothers who are pregnant. Symptoms include a fever, rash, joint pain, and red eyes. So if these are symptoms you're experiencing, especially after a trip to Brazil, see your doctor. And then we get to the real dangerous virus here, Ebola. This is a virus that when infects the body basically causes the internal organs to liquefy. And essentially your insides begin to leak out your various orifices. And this is a very painful, excruciating process that almost no one survives. What makes Ebola most problematic is that it's highly infectious, which means that if you're exposed to the tainted, infected fluid of an Ebola person who's suffering and has succumbed and died as a result of exposure to Ebola, if you're exposed to those fluids, you run a very high risk of contracting the virus yourself. The virus does a very good job of jumping from the host that it has killed to a new host that it has yet to infect. The good news about Ebola is that it's not respiratory. It's not spread through an infected person exhaling and another person inhaling the virus. Now it could mutate, so it could do that, but we haven't seen any evidence that that's happened yet. Again, with Ebola, in order to contract it, you have to essentially come in contact with fluids, bodily fluids. And when I talk about bodily fluids, just about anything that's any fluid that your body produces from any gland, is usually filled with these Ebola viruses. The Ebola tends to concentrate in tropical zones. The largest outbreaks have been in West Africa and Central Africa. But as we saw with the outbreak in 2014, the virus did manage to, via human hosts, travel to the United States and did make a presence in New York and Dallas. But those who were infected were identified relatively quickly. They were quarantined, and those who were infected either died or were able to actually recover when placed in modern medical facilities and given modern medical treatments. So this is the threat represented by infectious disease, and as you can probably imagine, traditional tools used to deal with security threats, like militaries, aren't much use here. They can be helpful with regards to setting up quarantine zones and providing support for medical staff who are doing the actual frontline work. But when we're talking about pandemics, we're talking mostly a civic reaction and a civic way of combating them. Basically, there's 3 steps to deal with these types of outbreaks. First, a state needs to have preparedness plans and be able to communicate clearly. In the United States, for example, we have preparedness plans in place for pretty much any possible outbreak of any infectious disease that's most likely to break out here. The second part of this, communication, is the tricky part because mass media today doesn't know how to approach these problems with any degree of candor or calm. When there is the threat of an outbreak, if there's evidence of an outbreak, you can rest assured that these media outlets, 24-hour news media, will blow everything out of proportion. And that's very dangerous because when you have an outbreak, you need the public needs to be communicated with in a calm, clear, rational manner. Instructions have to be given, instructions with regards to what to do if you have symptoms, where you need to go, where you shouldn't go, how to cooperate with authorities if there's an outbreak and certain parts of the city are closed off, how to cooperate with instructions from medical professionals, any number of things that are extremely important that the public have to be able to do and have to be able to follow instructions calmly. And that cannot happen in a world filled with the type of media we have. So it's a bit of a digression there, but something to think about. Secondly, a state should have the ability to detect and surveil those who are potential carriers for infectious diseases. And a lot of this is done at the border. A lot of this is done at immigration checkpoints. We have technology now where you can take someone's temperature from a distance essentially a little device that shoots a little laser beam that can read a body temperature from 100 feet away. This means that as people get off a plane that came from an area in a part of the world where there's an outbreak of infectious disease, you can basically take everyone's temperature in a very non-invasive way, and identify those who are, have fevers, and then pull them aside and say, we need to do some more tests on you to make sure that you're not testing positive for Ebola or something like that. If you do have an outbreak, it's very important to contain those who are infected to a specific area as quickly as possible, and to ensure that those who are infected do not spread the disease everywhere else. And this gets kind of tricky because when you talk about containment and quarantine, you're essentially talking about the curtailment of certain political rights. You're basically preventing people from traveling freely. You're basically confining them against their will to a particular space, whether it's a room or a certain compound with outside, whatever it is. And this can be very controversial and very problematic, especially if the nature of the threat isn't known. I believe during the last Ebola outbreak, there's a big deal was made because a woman who was working with the Ebola patients in Africa flew back to the United States, and she was tested, had a fever that was slightly high, and the governor of New Jersey ordered her quarantined until her fever came down, or there was evidence that she didn't have the disease. Turns out she never had the disease in the first place, and I think she tried to explain this and why she didn't have it. But, in these situations, states, in the name of public health, can forfeit your rights, and that's a very problematic set of questions to have to deal with. Two agencies I want to mention here that deal with outbreaks, that have primary responsibility with dealing with outbreaks. The first one is a global organization. It's an organ of the United Nations, the World Health Organization. People sometimes think that this is a medical organization in the sense that it has doctors going around the world and curing people and providing children with vaccinations or things like that. It's actually not true. That the World Health Organization is basically a data collection agency. It collects data from states, from public health ministries, and health and human service departments around the world. It publishes that data. It writes up guides and pamphlets and how-to books with regards to dealing with outbreaks, dealing with certain diseases, how to prevent certain diseases. And all this is very valuable information. But the World Health Organization isn't equipped and doesn't have the ability and doesn't pretend to have the ability to go and actually confront outbreaks when they occur. The organization that can do this kind of activity is actually not an international institution. It's an American agency, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Whenever you have an outbreak of Ebola or SARS or something like that, usually the lead agency is going to be the Center of Disease Control. They're going to go out, usually in tandem with the World Health Organization. And these will be actual doctors and medical professionals. They'll work with some non-governmental organizations like Doctors Without Borders. And they will set up clinics. They will actually set up facilities to confront and deal with the outbreak that's taking place somewhere in the world. Again, the primary responsibility is to deal with outbreaks in the United States, but because this sort of capability is very expensive, a lot of developing countries don't have the technology, don't have the number of doctors necessary to fund this kind of work, to staff this kind of work. The CDC turns out to be one of the leading global organizations to deal with this kind of work. I want to conclude this discussion of infectious diseases by pointing out a few obstacles that are going to be a problem in the future. One is that globalization continues, that there's more and more air travel taking place. There's more and more trade taking place. That a lot of the food that you purchase at the grocery store is produced and packaged overseas, um, in Central America and the Caribbean, Mexico. A lot of food is produced there, and as we've seen, a lot of at least like the last swine flu epidemic had its origins in Mexico. And there's a real risk that some of these diseases can get into the biomass, into the food supply, and can be spread around the world in a very short period of time. Another very controversial topic is the availability of drugs, especially cheap generic versions of expensive drugs. And this is especially a problem in sub-Saharan Africa, where we see astronomically high HIV/AIDS infection rates. And the argument here is that these people, obviously, who are suffering from HIV/AIDS can't afford these astronomically high costs associated with these drugs, that they need cheaper versions of them in order to have any chance of saving their life or prolonging their life. And of course, the drug manufacturers are reluctant to make these cheaper versions available or make the patents available because they want to recoup their costs. But this gives them a lot. This gets them a lot of criticism because they're essentially being accused of putting profits over people. I want to turn now to another type of virus, essentially, the problem of cybersecurity. This is a problem that we're seeing primarily in the developed world, so we can call it a first world problem. And it basically addresses the need to protect the facilities and capabilities around cyber communication, the ability to communicate over the internet and all the various applications that facilitate this communication. And it's not just the actual sources of communication themselves, but things like data storage, data exchange, all the hardware that enables the internet to be possible. Because we have to remember that the internet is not just something that exists in the air. It's that massive amounts of actual tangible hardware are necessary to make the internet work, to store all that data. And that data can be very, very vulnerable if you don't have not just cyber security in terms of password protection and preventing the data from being hacked or stolen or what have you, but actually protecting the physical infrastructure itself, the buildings where all these servers are housed. So this is very much an emerging threat, so very emerging security concern. So obviously, when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about the security of cyberspace. In that sense, it's not unlike the traditional notion of security being a way of protecting state territory or state space. And like I just mentioned, it's not just the protection of the virtual realm where data is stored or data is transmitted and consumed, but it's also the network, the cell networks, the cell towers, the landlines, the transmission lines, the storage farms, all this physical infrastructure that makes the internet possible. And like traditional security threats, we can talk about war in a cyber context. And not just cyber war, but various aspects of what we might think of as cyber war. So for example, we talk about cyber espionage, which we can understand as illegally accessing information that you're not entitled to or not authorized to see. States do this quite a bit. They attempt to gain access to top secret files of their rivals in order to basically spy on them, rather than do the traditional spying where you send in a human being to, open a file cabinet and take pictures of the files. All that stuff's stored online now, so the challenge now is to access that information by hacking into the storage facilities, the storage capability of that state, and it's the data that it contains. Cybercrime is using online tools to steal things. And here we're talking stealing information, and information that has direct impacts on real world realities. So for example, the ability to steal identities allows you to become something that you're not, become someone that you're not, to use that person's details to gain access to their private life, their bank accounts, their secret files, especially if they're someone who works for the government and has top secret clearance. Also, cybercrime can be an updated version of traditional bank robbery. That rather than grabbing guns and going to the bank and taking the money out of the vault, you simply hack into the computer system and transfer the numbers that represent the money from one account to the other. In many ways, this is a much more lucrative way of committing bank robbery, because you don't have to carry money out of a bank and run the risk of being caught as you drive away. This is all done instantaneously by simply transmitting information from one account to the other. And finally, we can talk about actual physical attacks, cyber attacks, where you use viruses, where you use a whole host of tools we'll talk about here in just a second, to cause real-world damage, to change and hack into facilities that control things like the doors of spillways on dams, or the fuel rods in nuclear power plants. If you could hack into these computer systems that control this physical infrastructure, you can cause meltdowns in nuclear power plants. You can cause cities to be flooded by opening the doors on a dam. You can cause sewage plants to taint the water supply by having certain doors and valves opened at the wrong time. You can even hack into cars and military vehicles theoretically, if you can access the computers that control the guidance, and literally command a weapon system to attack itself. There's few limitations on what you can do when you have all these things plugged into the internet. Most cyber attacks feature you deploying software in a particular way that allows you to either disrupt or destroy the cyber capabilities of an adversary, or to take control of those capabilities. And here we can talk about viruses and worms that can perform these functions. These cyber weapons can, again, incapacitate, can destroy, can delete key information, key files that result in damage because of the lost information. You have things like Trojan horses, which are programs that appear to be benign, appear to be normal, but actually have some kind of malware embedded within them. I believe the WikiLeaks getting hold of the Clinton campaign files was not the result of someone going into that account and hacking it. It was essentially a Trojan horse attack, or a phishing attack. It was someone sending an email to a campaign worker who, for whatever reason, clicked on the dubious link, and when they click on the link, that released the virus that caused all the files to be downloaded to the attacker's computer, and then that information was then turned over to WikiLeaks. You also have zombies and botnets. These are large collections of computers that are controlled by a sort of a single central computer that then sort of tap into this collective computing capability to attack a particular target. In other words, you can take laptops and desktop computers that might not have or have a limited amount of computing capacity. You can tap into several thousand or even several million computers around the world, oftentimes with the owners and operators not knowing that they're infected, and give orders for all those computers to attack a particular target, to send a DDoS attack to a particular target that causes a disruption. that prevents a site from being loaded properly, from being able to display properly, to any number of things that can cause a great deal of damage. These are called botnets because it's especially a net of robots. They're also called zombies because, like a zombie army, they're all being directed towards a single target, sort of mindlessly. We know that states engage in cyber attacks with each other. And there's a lot of focus on Russia in 2016 election, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But it turns out Russia was doing this long before 2016. The Russians have been doing this pretty much since the beginning of the internet. And even back into the Cold War, the Russians were trying to figure out how to use computer networks to their advantage. In 2008, for example, the Russians launched a cyber attack against Georgia that was sort of the first shot fired against Georgia before the actual physical invasion took place in August of 2008. The Russians launched cyber attacks against Estonia in 2009. Obviously here there was no actual invasion, but it was very disruptive. We know the Chinese engage in frequent cyber attacks and other types of aggressive cyber activities. We know the Israelis used a famous worm called Stuxnet that basically destroyed some of the Iranian nuclear production capability in 2010. And there's lots of rumors swirling about whether or not Stuxnet was purely an Israeli operation or whether the United States had a hand in that, in creating that virus. And of course, the United States is not some kind of victim in all this. That one of the things we learned when Snowden released the NSA files was the United States engaged in a whole array of cyber attacks against states it was not friendly with. And in some cases, states it was friendly with in the last few years. Cyberspace can also be a place where terrorism can thrive. And it's not just so much by using cyberspace as a way of committing terrorist acts, although that's obviously there's a great deal of that going on. More importantly, perhaps, cyberspace can be a place to recruit terrorists to do regular style terrorist attacks in the future. ISIS or ISIL is very effective, or historically has been very effective at recruiting attackers, recruiting people to come to Syria, to join ISIS, and in some cases not even to come to Syria, to stay where they're at and launch their own unilateral attacks by contacting them on the internet, by putting up propaganda videos that they'll watch and will contribute to their radicalization, by encouraging people to be creative, to go out to, in the name of ISIS, launch attacks. And we see lots of examples of this where people who in London, in Paris, in New York, were inspired by things they saw on the internet to go out and kill people and launch attacks without ever actually having to leave their house in many ways. Because cyberspace is a place you can hide more easily, terrorists, in fact, might even prefer to conduct their activities in some way, or the bulk of their activities online, because it's a more effective hiding space. You can disguise who you are on the internet. You can't necessarily do that in the real world. With cyberspace and securing cyberspace, there's a very interesting debate that has emerged in the last few years that sort of put the needs of the individual at odds with the needs of the state. Obviously, the state has a huge interest in protecting its cyber capabilities and its cyberspace. But in order to properly secure that space, it has to be able to surveil it. It has to know what's going on in that space. And this has created the need for it to create tools to be able to, in some ways, monitor what goes on in cyberspace. The problem is that many of us, when we go online, expect a certain degree of privacy, that we can communicate with other people through via social media platforms or via email or whatever it might be, without having this stuff looked at, without the government being able to look at these communications. Because a lot of it might be very embarrassing or perhaps if we're engaged in criminal activity, potentially result in an indictment. And indeed, we've seen some recent events that sort of put these questions into very stark relief. I've already mentioned WikiLeaks a little bit, and WikiLeaks proves to be very controversial because it obviously falls much more on the cyber freedom side of the question, believing that literally all information should be free, or almost all information should be free for the public to discover, to um, know about, to be exposed to, or what have you. And in many ways, we see cyber freedom as this force for good in the world. The Arab Spring was very much an inspiring event because ostensibly those of all of us who love freedom and democracy were inspired by the ability of the protesters in Egypt and Tunisia to use cyber tools, to use the internet to strengthen and launch their revolt against the authoritarian governments of Egypt and Tunisia and what have you. But then you have someone like Snowden come along and say, hey, these authoritarian governments in Egypt are acting no differently than the United States itself, because the United States turns out to have the most invasive and comprehensive spying capabilities than even some of these authoritarian states in the Middle East. So on the one hand, you can't be encouraging cyber freedom in the Middle East with the Arab Spring, and then trying to defend an institution like the National Security Agency, which has very invasive technologies that can literally read every email that we write and eavesdrop on every phone call that we make. So I talked about WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks was founded by Julian Assange, who has been holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy for, I think, like almost 5 years now. I can't believe it's been that long. Before he was hiding out, he wrote a manifesto of sorts where he basically put forth his belief on why it was important to make information public. And it was especially important to make secrets public because authoritarian systems, authoritarian states, and in his world, most states are authoritarian somehow. Information and withholding information was the source of their power. It was the source of their oppression, you might say. And that you could bring these states and these networks and these governments down, you could weaken them by exposing their secrets. You could create transparency, know what the state's doing, and more effectively try to change the government and politics of a state when you had access to the same information that the state had. That you could use cyberspace and the networks of cyberspace to get around the restrictions of the state. If you lived in a state that had firewalls and other types of restrictions on information, you could access networks in other countries, get around those restrictions and obstacles, and expose the true nature of government and governing and the corruption that exists in the world. And this is why the Arab Spring was so important for people like Assange and for those who support the work of WikiLeaks and similar endeavors. That you have, in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, authoritarian governments that try to clamp down on the free expression of their people who are engaged in corrupt practices and graft and favoritism of all sorts of, in all sorts of ways. And that when the secrets of these regimes are revealed, when, for example, WikiLeaks releases the State Department cables that tell the truth, that reveal sort of in a frank way the true nature of the corruption in a place like Tunisia. People read this for the first time. And even though they know it on some level, they see it officially written out in an American diplomatic cable. The government of Tunisia is corrupt. It's right there in an official cable. We have confirmation of what we all know. And then this empowers people. It brings them out of their homes, out of their neighborhoods, into the streets, into the squares, demanding change, demanding new governments. And if those governments don't succumb to the will of the people, then the people will bring them down and replace them with new leaders. Again, very empowering, very revolutionary, very inspiring if you sort of have a romantic feel for this. In fact, the United States and the U.S. foreign policy establishment actually encouraged this kind of activity. I have a quote here from a speech Hillary Clinton gave back in 2010, which basically talks about how email and social media and different ways of communicating in cyberspace were going to bring about changes in those authoritarian countries. And of course, Hillary Clinton and other State Department officials had countries like Iran and North Korea and the so-called axis of evil countries. That this more open communication, this freer flow of information was going to bring down these authoritarian regimes, which is something the U.S. foreign policy establishment wants to see. They want to see these regimes toppled and replaced with more friendly regimes. But of course, what we learn with the increasing amount of free information is that actually it's the United States that has the most to hide. That's what the Edward Snowden files revealed, that aside from these authoritarian regimes that closely monitored and spied on their own people, it was the United States, the bastion of freedom and democracy, that was the genuine threat to the free flow of information. Not so much in terms of actually inhibiting free flow of information and creating restrictions and firewalls, but in terms of surveillance, which is a type of censorship ultimately. If you know someone is reading your emails, you're going to censor what you say. And so the idea that it was the United States that had the greatest capability in terms of surveillance, in terms of monitoring communications on cyberspace, was quite the revelation, and was, showed a certain amount of hypocrisy on the part of American foreign policy establishment, who on the one hand are saying free information is great, it'll cause authoritarian regimes to fall, and then immediately we have the Snowden revelations, and it turns out that the United States really isn't interested in free information, or not nearly as much as we thought, because of these programs that the NSA was engaged in. Which brings us back to Russia and the recent election of 2016. A lot of accusations have been leveled against Russia, and some of the more exaggerated ones suggest that the election was literally fixed by Russian hacking. This is misinformed. Russia didn't actually hack or break into any election machines or any kind of election equipment. We don't have any evidence of that. It's entirely likely that they tried or they're working on those capabilities, but we have no evidence that Russia hacked the election by breaking into voting equipment. What we do know is that attacks, or not even attacks, but phishing software, Trojan horses, were opened by Clinton campaign workers. That when that malware was opened, caused those files that were stored on those computers, sensitive information, to be downloaded to the attackers' computers, and that information was then turned over to WikiLeaks. And we have good evidence that the people who launched these attacks, who set out these phishing expeditions, the sources of these computers were Russian, or somewhere in Russia. We don't know if they were government computers. We don't know if Putin ordered this operation, if it was just freelance hackers hacking and causing trouble, or if it was an actual Russian military or Russian political operation. We don't really know yet, and we may never know the full story. But what we do know is that that the ability of Russia to get involved in U.S. election has largely been accomplished because of the ability of social media itself to be manipulated by external impulses and external stimuli. Facebook, for example, is set up to obviously monitor all your activity on Facebook so that it will show you more of the things you already like. And that's why when you click like buttons, you're basically telling the whole world what your what your preferences are, what your likes are, what are the things you like most, where your favorite movies, books, all that information is collected and used to give you more of the same stuff. Which means that if you're using Facebook in a particularly partisan way, you enjoy certain stories about, Hillary Clinton and how she's corrupt or whatever, you're going to, so Facebook is going to move you in a direction so that you see more of these types of stories. And eventually, stories that aren't true, the so-called fake news, is generated that Facebook will direct you towards, that you will see and believe because you believed everything else, because you are consuming all this information and all these types of stories, that you lose the ability to think critically, to read critically, and it all sort of blurs together, and that you don't notice that when the real news gives way to the fake news. And this works on both sides. Both sides are guilty of this, and I'm not just being, guilty of both sidism here. Um, both sides both partisan camps are susceptible to fake news. We know that. And this raises a bigger question of the idea of elections perhaps being forever tainted, because the assumption of a free and fair election is that people can get access to information in order to make up their minds on who to vote for. But if they're making their decisions based on fake news, based on false information, based on sensationalism and exaggerated stories, then are they actually making an informed choice? And if they're not making an informed choice, then is a fundamental element of democracy being undermined? And what are the consequences of this? We just don't know. And we'll see what happens in the future.